on Channel News Asia.
Who cares, why we should care, and what needs to be done about it. That was a snippet from a short film called Please Help the World, produced for the Copenhagen Summit, which began on Monday. Now, welcome to 360. My name is Melissa Hyak, and joining me in the studio today are Ambassador Holger Stander-Schultz, Head of the European Union Delegation to Singapore, Professor Simon Tay, Chairman of the Singapore Institute of International Affairs, and Dr. Asanga Gunawansa, Assistant Professor from the School of Design and Environment at the National University of Singapore and the Asia Pacific Center for Environmental Law. Now, gentlemen, before we begin our discussion, let's have a listen to some remarks from the President of the Copenhagen Climate Conference.
The science has never been clearer. The solutions have never been more abundant. Political will has never been stronger. And let me warn you, political will never be stronger. This is our chance. If we miss this one, it could take years before we get a new and better one, if we ever did.
Now, gentlemen, the prevailing sentiment as expressed by the President of the Climate Change Conference appears to be it's now or never, very urgent, very serious, but some seem to think it's an exaggeration. Do you agree?
I absolutely agree that it's now is the moment. It's no exaggeration at all. I think now is the moment. I think there's momentum. There are a lot of countries that are working towards this at the moment in a very, very dynamic and positive way. So I think it is the moment, and I think there will be a chance.
I think it's increased dramatically. I think the US position over the last weeks has really improved things, and China's weighing in as well has been very important. But I'm not sure about the second part. It's now, but I'm not sure it's never, because I think that we're going to have to go beyond this and hopefully conclude something in the next year.
I think the countries that were initially reluctant during the Kyoto Protocol seem to have come around, and they seem to agree now that certain actions need to be taken in order to deal with it. So I do agree with my two other speakers that the time is right.
Well, the urgency of the matter, I mean, despite recent revelations that possibly some scientists might have manipulated data to present a case that's more urgent than before. I mean, have you not met people who's perhaps will or who's less convinced that something needs to be done now than before?
No, I think
there
might be someone who has manipulated some data, maybe, but that has nothing really to do with the overwhelming scientific evidence there is. I mean, we all have experienced that to a certain degree. I think there is no real danger that these doubters would win in this case. I think it's quite clear that the data stands.
Well, as far as this cause is concerned, I understand that Europe seems to feel that is in a position to be a deal maker. So what makes you think that, or what makes the union, the group, think that it's in a position to be that way?
Well, we have worked very, very consistently for a long time towards having a reduction of the warming up of the climate. I mean, we have been the first ones to work for a Kyoto Protocol. We set out very ambitious goals already at a very early stage, and we are a committed group that we work towards this end. I think that is our track record that will be the one that makes us possibly a deal breaker.
But a very quick one. I want to hear from your points of view that whether or not how Asia compares with perhaps Europe in terms
Well, I think that Europe presents a model which is completely not applicable to most of Asia outside of Japan. And in fact, while Europe has done something very important for its own, own economy, its own stand on this, I think in some ways to think of a European type model for the rest of the world is clearly a difficulty in itself. If we try to hold the developing countries, the large developing countries with a lot of poverty, to the same kind of approach, the kind of standards, I think we're asking for a big fissure between North and South.
I think you've hit on one huge issue. I think one big reason why it's so hard to agree on binding targets is because of the perception that it will put restrictions on economic growth. And I think former President of the European Commission, Romano Prodi, summed it up quite well. Let's have a listen.
People are happy to have a cleaner world. The problem is, do we destroy our productive capacity or not?
Well, UN experts say that countries must make emission cuts of 25 to 40% below 1990 levels by the year 2020 to ensure that global temperatures rise by no more than 2 degrees Celsius in the next 10 years. And they want ambitious midterm targets for developed nations and appropriate cuts for developing ones. Now, that proposal is rather contentious. I mean, developing countries like India, for example, disagree with it. It assumes that carbon emissions peak by year 2020. India says that capping emissions so soon will hamper their growth.
That's probably very likely. I mean, there's a kind of interlocking triangle. You know, if you want to grow economically, you will use more energy. If you want to use more energy, at the present time, you will have to use carbon. If you look at where India and China are, there's just no way that the renewables at this present state of technology will be enough for them.
But I would like to point out that it does not mean that you will reduce your economic growth by reducing your emissions. It has been proven by Europe. We have done over the last years from 1990 to 2007, we grew by an average in Europe 45%, and we reduced our emissions by 9%. UK managed to reduce their emissions by 20% and growing by 48%. So it is not incompatible at all, and I think we can do it. Obviously, the developing countries have a different role than the developed countries. Developed countries have to work harder at it.
Well, it still could mean some initial pains, and it could cost some political, cost the government some political mileage with their people.
Yeah, the developing countries like India and China put together has 40% of the world's population. And if you look at these two countries, most of the people, live under the poverty line. And the governments in these countries are responsible, to their people to make sure that the economic dreams of these people are achieved. So while you can look at the future generations and, do this cutback, you're also responsible for the current generation and ensure that the economic growth in these countries, stay on track. So I do agree with the ambassador, that it can be done, but for it to be done, for example, to have green economies, then the developing countries need, more stronger assistance from the developed countries in the form of financing, technology transfer, and so on.
Well, we'll be looking at that a bit more later, but then even the size of this emission cut, or the temperature, for example, there's some nations that say, look, 2 degrees Celsius is not enough. We need to get it down to 1.5 for it to make a difference to weather changes that would not affect their nations.
Well, I think that this is where the science comes in. And again, developing countries, frankly, have to take the science and these estimates as something that somebody else has put up in terms of the exact numbers. I mean, clearly climate change is there, but the urgency, the exactitude, I think those are things that developed countries really need to ask themselves. This is where demonstration is very important. Demonstration of goodwill to give financing, to provide technology, to provide capacity building and adaptation. I think this is where, if the developed countries want to take the lead, this is the way of leadership, not to badger.
Okay, we'll go into that a bit more after the break. Still to come, adopting green policies makes climate sense, but for some countries, they still say it doesn't make economic logic. We'll talk about that after the break.